I really like the concept of the right idea at the wrong time and place. It's hard to compare it to anything in real life other than perhaps having a breakthrough in advanced astrophysics and discussing it with your milkman, but the timing of an idea does nothing to devalue it. In the endless pursuit to innovate and revolutionize games as we know them today, developers have frequently done some truly crazy things in order to shake things up a bit. Often a bit too crazy, in a way that demonstrates just how unusual it is for this certain game to do this certain thing. But honestly, where would we be if video games didn't take risks? It's a disturbing thought to imagine a world where developers stop trying to push the envelope of game design, but thankfully there's still a ton of creative minds in the industry, as well as aspiring indie creators making weird and wonderful games on the regular. So hopefully we won't have to be forced to play boring games. And yet so many people do it anyway. But hey, given the choice between playing the same couple types of games for the umpteenth time and being exposed to a genuinely creative game concept that allows me to see a genre or gaming in general in a new light, there's no real competition there. The wonderfully ironic example that comes up surprisingly often is when a game has one really good idea but surrounds it in a whole load of useless crap that brings down the whole experience. So you have a really cool idea that I'd love to see develop further, hiding amongst a stormy sea of glitches and terrible optimization. I'm not sure there's any kind of relocation program for neglected bits of clever game design, but maybe I just need to get the word out. Together, we will work towards a better tomorrow, or at least less shitty video games. I don't think that's too much to ask for. All the big innovations these days seem to come from how a player interacts with the world around them. We've seen over the last couple of years that it's not enough to present the player with obstacles to overcome. There has to be an element of freedom of choice about it, so that every playthrough is organically different with the sense that anything can happen. This is great, but not always achievable depending on what studio is making the game, what game is being made, and especially what era of gaming history you're operating within. So while everyone might want to make Grand Theft Auto or Breath of the Wild, sometimes you have to set your sights a little lower and settle for revolutionizing how a player can manipulate enemies to do their bidding. That's basically the only thing that MindJack did right. I bet no one's talked about this game for a good few years, and there's a couple of good reasons why you might not want to. MindJack wasn't very well received when it came out, making numerous lists at the end of 2011 for being one of the worst games of the year, despite having an intriguing premise and developers who had worked on Lost Odyssey and ports of No More Heroes 1 at the helm. A good 95% of this game is on fire and barely functional, which makes it a challenge to enjoy MindJack's big gimmick: hacking and controlling the environment around you, including enemies. In such a drab, joyless game, being able to control your opponents and use them to fight for you is surprisingly entertaining, and may well have helped to inspire games like Watch Dogs and Horizon Zero Dawn that expanded this concept with a more satisfying framework without all the poor optimization and terrible design decisions. I mean, if you can put this good concept into a game that isn't utter shit, I might be more interested. Not every game on here will be among the annals of worst game ever, but it's encouraging to know that even really terrible games can accidentally stumble across a good idea or two that can help ease the pain of realizing just how much money you've wasted on this piece of crap. You know, it's like waking up on Christmas morning and realizing that, hey, you haven't got any presents, but being thankful that, you know, you've survived another night. You didn't die in your sleep. That's the level of optimism that we're going to be working with on this video. Enemy AI is such a gloriously stupid crapshoot. So many games come so close to getting it right, but fall just short, leading to all manner of exploits and really funny instances of AI walking into walls or fire. Enemy AI in most forms has never really been boring, which is another way of saying when it's done really, really well, it can be really fucking cool. AI is a tricky thing to get right. Most people will settle for artificial intelligence being realistic enough to not disrupt their suspension of disbelief, which is something that is regularly at risk in your average video game. So when a game like Ekko goes above and beyond what is typically expected and crafts an entire game around manipulation of enemies, suddenly you've got a game concept that uses a fundamental mechanic as a means of inspiring creativity and giving the player a truly unique experience that they can't find anywhere else. Just so long as it's not too shallow. Ekko came out with so little fanfare 2 years ago that I honestly thought something had gone wrong with its release. It didn't sell very well, leading to the closure of developer Ultra with a release catalogue consisting of just the one video game, but when the core concept of Ekko is such a fascinating idea, I'm still not sure why this didn't sell very well. The game world around you keeps a record of how you kill enemies and modifies their AI to become smarter with every enemy you defeat. Which is cool, we've seen something like that before, but the truly wild thing is that killing one of these copies in a certain way will be learned by the AI and used against you, creating this ridiculous gameplay loop where you can't rely too much on one method or else it'll be used against you, which is something that I have always wanted a game to do. It's fucking terrifying. We've had adaptive AI that learns from the player as you go, but I can't recall a game like this ever being made before. If the execution was a little sharper and Ekko had more depth to it, somewhat akin to the kinds of options you had in something like Metal Gear Solid 5, I think we would have all been talking about this game in 2017. It's not a terrible game, but it did kill an aspiring indie studio. And murder is a crime after all. You will struggle to find a more underused feature than player deaths. Sounds like a weird thing to be concerned about that you maybe shouldn't be looking at as something that needs creativity sprinkled all over it, but the very few times a game has done something different with what happens when you die, it's created some very interesting scenarios. Lethargy sets in because developers can't be bothered to do anything with death other than have it act as a failsafe when the player does something wrong, which works well to a point, but it's what everyone does. Can't you just try a little harder and think of something original? Well, back in 2012, when Konami were putting their names to video games and not pachinko machines, they were involved in the publishing of a funky little game called Never Dead, where you play as a demon hunter called Bryce, who is cursed with immortality. And that's a really cool idea for a video game! Emphasis on idea, because an idea is worth nothing if you're not willing to work for it and get the most out of it. Never Dead has an excellent premise where Bryce is able to lose body parts without any major repercussions because he can stagger and roll around until he's picked them all up. You can be just ahead and still be alive and kicking, minus the kicking, opening up doors for puzzle solving and creative solutions for defeating bosses. Not that you're technically immortal though, since Bryce's head is vulnerable to certain enemies and certain NPCs can still take damage and will trigger a game over should they die, so Never Dead manages to keep things sensible, but only in some areas. The issue of losing your limbs in combat is quickly made apparent when you lose an arm and can't fire a gun, or lose a leg and most of your mobility with it. In any other game you'd be taking damage, but here you're dying a slow death punctuated by lethargic combat that takes ages since you keep falling apart, and a concept that is really fucking interesting is never realised in an enjoyable way. Never Dead feels a lot like a cheesier cut-price Devil May Cry in a lot of places, which just makes me wonder how DMC would handle Dante's immortality. As long as I don't have to keep picking up my fucking leg every 5 seconds, you've got a deal. Do you know the ultimate danger when dealing with new ideas? Replacing the old ones, actually, despite what you might stand to gain from doing so. It's a bold step, which is why so few developers ever even attempt to go through with it, but it's a riskier move when you're overwriting something that has already been proven to work. Even more so when there's no reason to change anything. I don't have to talk about BanjoKazooie for very long before everyone is inevitably reminded how this franchise left Nintendo's custody for Microsoft's warm, moist hands, and went from a platforming powerhouse to a very strange car construction game, where you can create whatever shaped vehicle you want to roam this huge world and defeat Gruntilda's jar-bound skullhead and all her many modes of transportation. Yeah, it's fine, it's like a normal Banjo game except there's no platforming and infinitely more cars. And people really like cars, right? You'd have to go quite far to find someone who doesn't think that BanjoKazooie Nuts and Bolts is a hideous mistake that taints the legacy of the BanjoKazooie series that it spent so long building up. But despite this, I can't in good faith say that building cars and planes isn't a really fun concept that surprisingly brings out a creative side of me that doesn't get much practice outside of Mario Maker. And hey, this game came out 7 years before the first Mario Maker, so that itch was getting scratched nice and early. One of the weirdest feelings I've ever felt playing a video game is kind of enjoying BanjoKazooie nuts and bolts. Conceptually, it hurts my soul and makes me angry that Microsoft's corporate mindset deemed that this type of game had to be attached to the Banjo name. But when you really get down to it, this is a very creative game that tries things that so few games ever go near. I'm not about to turn around and say that Nuts and Bolts is an underappreciated work of art that you need a high IQ to understand, since to suggest that would run counter to every fibre of my being that wants a platforming renaissance by any means necessary. But I do think that Nuts and Bolts' gameplay without the force tied to the Banjo name and characters would have gone down a hell of a lot better. In its current state, you have a really interesting idea for a game that would be the perfect concept for anything to do with Lego, but it's awkwardly surgically attached to a mascot that has nothing to do with any of this. Just like a reminder that if you've been enjoying this video and want to see more, then feel free to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications of every new video. There's a time and place to do this, and it wasn't 8 years after the last major Banjo game. Although, with a Smash Bros appearance under their belt these days, maybe a combination of Nintendo, Microsoft, Rare, and or Playtonic can work towards giving the world a new BanjoKazooie game. And then maybe a weirdly timed car building sequel, just for good measure. It's just covering all the bases. Video games are mildly obsessed with silent protagonists. There was a time when I really didn't like them and saw their oversaturation as a sign of laziness in the game industry and a reluctance to write good dialogue for the main character, but I can see the perspective of letting the protagonist be a blank slate for the player to live through. It works so well for Link and Gordon Freeman, so why would you stop there? In fact, why not screw around with how the player perceives the story as it unfolds before them? Other games try non-linear storytelling that you have to piece together slowly, but 2018's The Quiet Man had the novel idea of making the protagonist deaf instead. Not mute, just deaf. Maybe this will start a new trend. I mean, hopefully not, because the publicity surrounding this game before it came out was a little too pretentious for my taste, since the devs decided that they were making some incredible piece of art that underlines the power of words or something. I think it's useful to remind yourself that there's a video game here that can be enjoyed in my underwear with a general disdain for over-artsy crap that is too concerned with using copious amounts of cutscenes to tell a boring story that barely uses the fact that the protagonist is deaf to tell a uniquely engaging narrative. Is it the worst game of last year? It's not far off if it isn't. But somewhere in this smouldering, steaming dumpster fire is an unbelievably ambitious idea. A deaf protagonist is such an interesting idea that changes how you receive information from the world you're exploring that, if done right, could potentially act as a window into what life is like for deaf people. You'd have to put a lot of work in to get the most out of this and to do so in a respectful way that isn't as insultingly ham-fisted as The Quiet Man, but I think if there's another way of altering a protagonist without making them mute, then why not make them deaf instead? Or blind, but I think that would be a few steps too far. Maybe we'll get there one day though. This is RabbidLuigi, and the possibility of a deaf protagonist would change any video game, but maybe it would put a great emphasis on visual design. We have to tell the player what to do and where to go without having a sidekick chirp in their ear every 30 seconds. Would be very annoying, don't do it. Games like Inside master dialogue-free storytelling, and a game where maybe you take in information visually, maybe that goes down really well. Maybe we really enjoy that. Although, I can imagine the sound design department would be fucking furious. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.